culture. Welcome, Christine.
Hi, Ed. Thanks for having me.
I am delighted to be talking with you, though we have to start by pointing out the irony that we are having this conversation over Zoom. And
Yes,
the
undermining so many arguments I'd like to make about
the
face-to-face connection.
soul-sucking, disembodied void that we've all spent so much time on over the past few years. So maybe to bring some humanity back into this at the beginning to salvage the black rectangles of doom surrounding us. What inspired you to write this book? How are you thinking about the word experience here?
Well, it's funny. I've studied technology's impact on human behavior for a long time, written a lot about the development of particularly personal technology, the smartphone, and in particular. But what I noticed a few years back is that as the smartphone became sort of a Swiss Army knife for everyone's daily life, that we were spending more and more time having experiences through our technologies rather than having them be tools that help us as humans have day-to-day human experiences. And then I had read a few years back an essay by a naturalist named Robert Michael Pyle, and he was talking about his concern about younger generations who grow up in a world where they don't encounter, the messy outdoor experience of getting their hands dirty, of seeing the natural world, of understanding ecosystems, and that if you raise a generation of children who don't have that hands-on experience with the world, they won't know what's missing when, say, a species goes extinct or an ecosystem dies. And it really stayed with me, this idea that there will be future generations who don't understand what they've lost because we haven't actually accounted for it. So that started me down a sort of rabbit hole of thinking about all the day-to-day things that have been transformed by mediation, by using a screen, from face-to-face interaction to things we used to do with our hands, even to the way that we educate kids and the way that we ourselves interact with our friends and loved ones. So that's how it started, was just as a sort of question about what have we lost? Not because I want to give up technology, I use it every day, but just to sort of account for the things that have gone missing or extinct.
Yeah, I was really struck a few years ago when one of my kids picked up a magazine and started trying to tap it,
Hmm.
and scroll and
Hmm.
swipe. And many people have remarked on how quickly kids pick up these interface gestures and how intuitive that is. But it was just a sign of how quickly and profoundly the experience of growing up and our experience of the world has changed when you do it in the mediated through all of these screens. So I guess to follow up on this personal side of things, has this book changed how you think about your own face-to-face interactions? You know, if we're losing things, do you have thoughts on how we can recover them or how we can move forward from here? Because unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to, just bury all the smartphones in a landfill somewhere.
Right.
So what do we do?
Well, it's interesting. I This is always the puzzle when you write a book that's sort of a critique, because then your lovely editor will turn to you, as mine did, and say, "Okay, so how do we solve this problem?" And I was trained as a historian. I'm like, "Wait, I'm just supposed to describe the problem, right?" No, but I have actually thought, both in my own personal life, but also through interviewing a wide range of people and a wide range of backgrounds. Uh, and some of this will sound mundane, but hopefully it's helpful. One of the things that for me personally was the most useful was noticing how often I filled interstitial time, those little moments of the day where I was between work and home or commuting or waiting for something, how often I reached for my phone to entertain myself and distract myself. I figured, oh, I study this stuff. I'm very aware. Well, I was shocked when I tried to go 24 hours without filling those little moments here and there with a phone. And so I decided to do a challenge and say, okay, well, let me try always not to reach for the phone first. And what I found is that I noticed a lot more about where I was at that moment. I also found my mind wandering in a very creative and productive way, having ideas about things I was working on at the time. I also just was calmer because I wasn't getting a kind of constant stimulation. Now, does that mean that I ignored texts from my children? No, I didn't do that. But so as a practical tool, the phone is still always there. But cultivating awareness of how often we're choosing the mediated way of living versus the real embodied face-to-face human interaction in the real world, and how often we tune out the real world for our mediated worlds. That really, I think, is the best advice I can give people, is to start noticing how often you live that way and see if there's a difference, if you notice, and then maybe change your behavior a little bit.
Yeah, I've never been a smoker, but I've started to think about smartphones as like cigarettes and a thing you reach for when you just need this quick hit and you're basically trying to escape the ennui and stress of regular life. But more often than not, the hit is just more stress and anxiety, right? Because it's some other entity or agent trying to colonize your attention and do
Mm-hmm.
something with it and get you thinking about something else and spiraling off potentially, or thinking about buying something. So I really like what you're saying about the regaining control of your attention, or having more intentionality about your attention and what you're going to spend your time on. But also that idea of daydreaming, which I'm a big fan of as well. I've spent a lot of time thinking about imagination. So, one thing that one of my favorite chapters in the book was your chapter about time and the whole idea of waiting. And I think you kind of talked a little bit about this already, and this idea that we're filling all of our interstitial moments. Um, but what do you think the larger consequences of this shift are when we're capturing every iota of attention? It's all being harvested by some social media company, or uh, the tools that we're using are getting really efficient and effective at making sure that there are lots of engineers whose job it is to maximize the amount of time we spend using their tool, right? So what do you see as the larger social consequences of that beyond just the creating individual personal space for mind wandering?
It's a great question because if you think about scaling up that issue of impatience, I think a lot of us feel a little anxious and harried and like we're constantly living in the now and in the moment. The flip side of that is the huge convenience of being able to get things on demand, not having to worry about, the efficiencies of some of the ways that we live our lives. But my concern is that it cultivates habits of mind in people that they then transfer to the rest of the real world. And by that, I mean, I started to look at things like the increasing rates of road rage and air rage and vast cultural impatience, markers of impatience. And it's interesting to me because I have a lot of social science friends who do a lot of quantitative analysis. They look at data, and if it's not in the numbers, it doesn't exist. If you can't measure it, it's not real. So I come from the humanities. I look at more qualitative things, which can't always be measured in the same way. But I talk to a lot of people. I observe a lot of behavior. And I don't think there was anyone I interviewed or talked to over the last few years working on this book who didn't comment on how impatient people were. And it was different from rudeness, for example. It was just everyone's in a hurry and no one has time for pleasantries. And then you start to see creeping into discussions in the sort of popular culture in general. Well, who needs pleasantries? They're inefficient. And so there are these little shifts that happen here and there, but taken together, it's a way of viewing the world as a place that should be as seamless and efficient and work for me as easily as possible. And that's all well and good until you run up against something you can't control and you can't push a button or swipe it away on your screen. And that's like, say, I don't know, a traffic jam, or, having to wait for your food to come out of a restaurant, or having to wait in a waiting room of a hospital because a loved one is there. So these are habits of mind that we have to cultivate. We have to practice these skills. And I think they've been devalued in a culture that wants us to feel like we can overcome some of our human limitations. And patience is an important virtue. And I do use the word virtue deliberately. I think we've lost sight of what the purpose of those are, not just for individual fulfillment and flourishing, but for how a society can get along when people disagree or when something goes wrong. So that's why cultural impatience matters. Think about legislation. If we have a problem that's going to take 10 years to solve and is quite complicated, if you have an impatient electorate, their representatives don't have much incentive to try to buckle down and start solving that problem.
Yes, this is something else that I'm really interested in, our relationship with the future and long-term thinking. And there's an interesting seeming paradox here, because you're talking about the immediate present, right? And our relationship with what is happening right now, and suggesting that maybe if we change that relationship, it changes our relationship with the future as well. Uh, and I'm really interested. I love you mentioned Julian Bleeker's the very slow messenger
Yes.
the tool that he made, which is sort of like a beeper or a text message system, but the message comes over the span of hours or days, right?
Mhm.
And I think there's a suggestion also that the more emotionally fraught the message is, the longer it takes to show up. So, uh, do you think that this it reminds me a little bit of the slow food movement,
Mhm.
this idea we need to slow down. So, do we need a slow news movement as well?
We do, and in that sense, I think we have to sort of reorient our thinking about waiting. Right now, we see waiting as delay. But waiting can be something, it can be about anticipation. And I think that's what the slow messenger attempts to do. I did, in the book, I did this very cliche thing that writers love to do. And I went to a monastery and, for a week, a silent retreat. I'm literally rolling my own eyes because it is a cliche. But I went with all these expectations that I was going to learn about attention. I was like, they're going to show me how to focus and do. But the message I received in all of that silence and following the prayer schedule and doing everything as I was told to do was how joyful all of the monks in this community were with waiting, because they are there for their entire lives, waiting to hear the voice of God. And the ones I spoke to said, "Well, I might never hear it, but I am just joyfully anticipating hearing it." And there was something about the joy that really struck me. They didn't see waiting as this horrible burden that they must overcome or develop an app for. They saw it as a natural and indeed necessary part of understanding the community and the world they were building. So obviously, we're not all monks, but we can start to see waiting as an important experience, something that actually it teaches us something, but it might also be necessary for solving some of these more complicated social problems in a very polarized world.
There's another fascinating juxtaposition there because partially what I hear you saying is this notion that when you pause, when you wait, you have to become comfortable with yourself, right? You have to be happy with who you are, and that for these monks, there's this sense of joy in
Mhm.
just being present and just waiting for this thing that might happen. And I want to come back to the idea of anticipation because it's such a great one, but. Uh, that seems almost at odds with the idea of sort of emptying yourself out, right? That as a monk, maybe you're supposed to be a vessel for the divine, right? That it's not about you, it's about this
Mhm.
larger, almost cosmic idea connecting with something much bigger. Uh, but it's working, right? For these monks are happy. And I want to hear, were you happy? Were you there? Did you feel this yourself?
So it took a few days.
Uh-huh.
My children were a bit younger at the time, so I at first I was like, "Am I happy because I don't have, two young kids pulling at me left and right, making demands?" But by day four, it was more peaceful happiness because first, obviously, many distractions are disappear. The uh, for the economists among us, I had fewer choices, which usually, again, we see as a negative thing, but I realize could be positive. Limiting the number of options you have actually can make you happier at certain stages of life. And just the slowness of time when it sunk in, and it does take a while, and people who go on retreats often reflect on this, and then coming out of it, how noisy and hectic and fast the world seemed returning to it. And so again, understanding that you can put yourself in environments where time has a different pace and that can be healthy and good. And then trying to find those moments in your day-to-day life, which is a real challenge. But it's more of a challenge than just downloading the newest meditation app, although there are many good meditation apps. It's a practice, it's habit. Again, I keep coming back to very Victorian sounding things like habits and virtues, but our technologies are training us in certain habits and virtues. So the question is, when do we need to choose the human form of that over the technological? Because now we actually have to choose. It didn't used to be the case, but now in many moments of our lives, we have to choose the analog face-to-face human interaction over the technologically mediated one.
Yeah, and so often that choice feels like something you have to make against the grain or
Exactly.
push back against this gravitational force that's pulling you towards a particular set of choices. So getting back to the question, I interrupted my own question because I'm so excited about this topic, is the kind of selflessness that maybe you touched on when you were in this monastery and that these monks are practicing feels different from the the hollowing out of the self that I think you see in the sort of contemporary consumer society. And I think we've all felt it that, well, why am I going to reach for my phone? Because I'm anxious or maybe even afraid that if I'm just stuck here in this room with myself right now, I'm going to be unhappy, right? So I want to, it's like you want this that boredom is a source of fear and anxiety. And so we reach for the distraction or personally, because I hate lines, right? And so I'm on this line, I'm mad about it, so I can distract myself, or I can be more efficient by,
Right.
getting something done that maybe I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So, are how do we disentangle those two kinds of emptying out of the person?
It's a great question. Actually, on your line point, by the way, I got to read all this fascinating Q. It's called Q psychology, QUE. The basically the science of standing in line, of which the Disney World, Walt Disney World people are kind of the genius students of this science, and practice it the most efficiently. But there are amazing tricks that you can build into waiting if you hate waiting in line. Like one of the examples I give in the book is at an airport where people were complaining about having to wait in line for their bags, right? Because the gate and the baggage claim were very close together. So the airport wisely was like, well, we'll just make it further. They'll have to walk further to the baggage claim. The amount of time between when they left the plane and got their bags was exactly the same, but they were only standing around waiting for a few minutes versus 10. So there is a psychology to it. But this erosion of a sense of self is really important. So in the 20th century, there were a number of cultural critics and sociologists, people like Christopher Lasch, Irving Goffman, others, who had this sense that modern society, and particularly Western consumer modern society, was making it more difficult for people to figure out who they were, right? They were taking all their cues from the outside world rather than developing inner certainty about that. They were not inner directed, they were other directed. They took everything from outside. Well, if you think about what kinds of behaviors and emotional experiences our social media platforms and technology platforms in general encourage us to do, it is to constantly perform ourselves from a very young age now for most kids in Western countries to perform a self before one has even fully formed. So what that I think creates is a lot of people who have a kind of fragmented sense of self, and you read these sort of heartbreaking stories of young men and women who literally can't really connect to the face they see in a mirror because they're so used to seeing a filtered version on Instagram. And that's an extreme case, but it speaks to a weird, unnerving sense that the development and formation of a healthy sense of self requires some really old-fashioned things, connections to people, a correction of one's behavior when one, steps over a line, learning from mistakes, friction, in other words. What does everything about our technological world encourage? Frictionless behavior, seamless things, ease, convenience, immediate gratification. So in a weird way, I think I would, I kind of wish Christopher Lasch or Neil Postman, some of these guys could come back and look at where we are now and remind us that, again, it's difficult to quantify the development of a self, but it's a hugely important part of what it means to be a flourishing human being. And we've lost sight of that in pursuit of some other goals that I think we're only now starting to realize might not contribute to flourishing.
So you've now given me the opportunity to ask you about Disney World. Uh, and I loved
It was a setup.
descriptions. That's right. Descriptions of it. And Disney World and the Disney Corporation is indeed, wizardly in their management of lines and making you feel like you're making progress. As juxtaposed with all of the terrible lines we've encountered, I was traveling with my family over the summer and we were trapped in a giant international airport with
Mm.
the line that we called the line just for fun because it just sort of spiraled into the middle of this room for no discernible reason. And then eventually you would get to the front and somebody would sort of bless you and permit you to then ascend an escalator to a different room. And
Where you still waited.
yeah, yeah, there was right, but it was there was sort of the performance of it, right, was poorly done. So uh the way you talk about Disney World reminds me of Jean Baudrillard, the philosopher's famous take on Disneyland in Simulacra and Simulation. That it's not that Disneyland is fake; it's that the rest of the world is so hyper real, so out of so beyond normal reality that Disneyland sort of makes it look better. It blurs the boundaries between fiction and reality. Uh, and so are we losing touch with a shared reality as we put more screens and filters between us and direct lived experience?
I think we are, and the Disney, it really did strike me when I went back to Disney with my own kids. So I was born and raised in Florida, so we would go all the time because we get these Florida cheaper tickets, in the when it's really really hot and the tourists really don't want to bother. Um, and the old school, I'm Gen X, so I will, I'll moan and cynically note how nobody understands us and how we were on top of this stuff early on, and roll my eyes at myself. But we were weirdly analog for important stages of development, and then had to make the switch to digital. So I do think it gives people of my generation not a cynicism but a healthy skepticism about some of this stuff. So when you go to Disney in the old days, they would do the winding lines, which from Q psychology teaches us keep people moving even a little bit, and they're less likely to get too restless. But that was about it. Like they just would, you'd wait in line. There was no fast pass or any of these wristbands or any of that stuff. But you go now, and it is an unusual experience, not only to wait in line super long waits because they time things now and it's very efficient, but to ever wait in line without also being entertained while in line. So there's, in some of the rides, you've got characters and screens, you've got stuff to watch. It's like you're inside a video game until you then get on the ride that is often linked to, the Disney universe. And so is that bad? No, not necessarily, because we don't spend our lives in theme parks. But what it reminded me of is our expectation in the real world, in the everyday world, which is, well, I should never be bored. I mean, now when I'm paying a fortune to take my kids to Disney World, I don't want anyone to be bored because I'm paying good money for everyone to be entertained. But I do think we've transported that expectation to our daily lives in a way that's unsustainable and also unhealthy, particularly for younger people who should understand that the world does have hardships and things to overcome, and does not always respond to your demands. So that was what struck me about the Disney experience. Not that they've become ever more sophisticated at meeting our needs, and they understand that we don't want to wait anymore. It's one of the major things they discuss in the corporation. Like, what is their major complaint? It's that people don't want to wait in line for anything. They don't want to wait for anything when they come to the park. So I found that sort of fascinating, that change.
It is really interesting. And this also brings us back to anticipation in a way, because one of the ironies of a place like Disney is that it is possible to have a bad time there. And, you see weeping children, you
Yes.
see angry parents, people get really stressed out. And now, because the experience is so much more technological, and you're managing some kind of app and the
Hmm.
wristbands and the timing and
Yes.
depending how deep you want to go into it, all these other websites and research you can do about what's the best time to do certain things. So
Hmm.
there's a whole logistical game you can turn the experience into, and then you can get really stressed out about that game, or you can just
Right.
be mad because you're stuck on a line, right? Or you're still
Yes.
having a bad time. And one of the things I loved in your book also is this study of a group of Dutch people around vacations and anticipation. And uh, the the truth that is probably familiar to most of us, that actually the anticipation of the thing is maybe more impactful than doing the thing itself.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about anticipation. Is that part of the set of practices that you think we should be honing?
Yes, and I think it's important for two reasons. One, because it helps us manage our expectations for what the real world experience might be. I think part of why we all love to plan things is that we're in charge and we're thinking of all these amazing possibilities. Maybe some of us who are a little more risk averse get the traveler's insurance and think, things could go wrong. But largely we're like, this is going to be amazing. You can sort of see the kind of documentary photographs, with the wonderful soundtrack of the vacation you're about to have in your mind. It's great. It's really fun. Then, of course, you get on vacation, the flight's delayed, the rental cars breaks down. All kinds of things can go wrong. But there is, at least you've had that experience of anticipating what it could be, a sort of idealistic experience. I think what our technologies do is they actually want to colonize anticipation. So if you think about like search engines like Google and other sorts of anticipatory technologies, they want to guess what you want before you even type it. Now, in some cases, that's harmless. But in a lot of cases, like, say, planning something particular to you and your family, or an event you want to go to, um, that can actually homogenize the experience. So if you're using, your mapping technology and it knows that you like certain restaurants when you're at home, it only suggests that same cuisine when you're elsewhere. That means you might not notice a restaurant. If we become reliant on this managed experience because it's convenient and efficient, we will miss out on other kinds of experiences, which, yeah, might go wrong, but also make for more human interactions. And the other part of anticipation that I think is worth understanding, and this is more in the context of things like live performance, music, comedy, artwork, museums, is that when we slow down and we actually, are patient enough to wait and be open to a new experience, we're also demonstrating humility. So if I could look at a digital image of a painting and never go to that museum, but I'm unlikely to really look at it, to sit and spend time and think, what is this artist trying to tell me? The same thing if somebody, I have a couple friends who are comedians. It's very different if I go to their show and I'm on, checking my email the whole time, right? And so lots of artists now make you put that phone away, and it's a different experience. If you've had both, there's a qualitative difference. So there's a kind of humility baked into waiting and being open to that experience without distraction that I think is also important.
So this also brings up another, I think this notion of colonizing and reframing cuts both ways, because the future and the past are both these places of imagination that we think about. And it reminds me of a phrase that we've adopted in our family from some friends of ours. Is this going to be a vacation or an experience?
Mm,
And sometimes the struggles and the trials and tribulations are part of what make it interesting, and that's what the terrible experience on your trip or your adventure is what makes the great story later on, and the thing
exactly.
that you
Yeah.
actually remember rather than the painting that everyone else has also seen, or and that you're taking the same picture with your smartphone that 10 million other people have taken with their smartphones. So do you see this kind of colonization or reframing of the past happening as well? Because one thing I notice is that because all of our attention is absorbed in the present and the now and the constantly refreshing feeds and all of that, there's no time to reflect on what has happened or do things like practice gratitude, sticking with our Victorian virtues theme for the day. Do you see that as well? Is that something that you came out in your research?
Yeah, one thing that was fascinating to me was how to put this, uh, how much our technologists want to manage our own memories. And I mean that in two senses. First of all, there are lots of companies that are eager to mine even your sleeping moments, your dreams, like dream mining, things like this. These are not dystopian futuristic scenarios or utopian, depending on your sensibility. They are things that are in the works. And so both for history, for our own individual past, wanting to sort of even the way that photo apps will display prompts to memory are curated in particular ways. And this question of whether we actually go back and, as you say, reflect and appreciate what we did in the past in the same way we did when it was harder to capture those moments. That really worries me just as a from a historical perspective, because our memories are being curated. There are now these tools where if you say you and your grandmother always wanted to go to Disney together, but she passed away before that ever happened, but you have a picture of your grandmother, you can send it to a company that will now create an actual photograph of you and your grandmother at Disney World together. And it becomes a tangible, you can print it out. It'd be a tangible document of something that never happened that you would have liked to have seen. So think about what that would do at scale for the ability to study the past, if you're a historian, for the verifiability of historical artifacts. So there's that whole issue. But then think about future stuff. If someone you love dies, you can now harvest their voice, send it off to a company that will create a chatbot using their voice, and you can talk to your dead loved one for as long as you want. And it can get quite personal because you can allow them access to your dead loved one's email and they can sort of harvest data from there. Does that allow us to understand and appreciate human limitation and to truly grieve? Because that is part of the human experience. I think that's also worrisome because it never allows the dead to die in the same way that for a goofy junior high student, their past can never die if they put it on social media, even when they're 40 years old. So these are deep questions that I think we are just starting to wrestle with, and the technology is way ahead of us. So we have to talk about them now.
Yeah, there's this kind of terrifying timelessness to it's as if time has all been taken and squashed onto a, I don't know what the right metaphor is. I'm imagining a slide in a microscope.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all there in the present, and it's all fungible and renegotiable and editable. There's no sense of a history that stays in the past and a future
Hmm.
that we're looking forward to. It's all just, well, what do you want to do right now? Uh, and you're right, it reminds me of your description of that teenager looking at themselves in the mirror and not recognizing who they are, because we anchor ourselves through these points.
Hmm.
We need an arc. Humans, I believe strongly that we're storytelling animals, and the story needs to have a beginning and a middle and an end. And you have to have all the pieces. You have to have a sense of the trajectory to really make sense of what's going on. So let me ask, where are we headed? Do you think we're getting any better at dealing with the cognitive impact of these new technologies? Are they evolving faster than we are? What's going to happen next?
The technology is definitely way ahead of us in terms of evolving in the sense that our technologists are very good students of human behavior and human nature. And I do believe there is something that we can kind of vaguely call human nature, and they know what makes us tick. What we don't understand is that much of the stuff that we use merely for convenience or connection is actually designed to keep us staring at it for all kinds of other reasons, some perfectly harmless, some nefarious. In the case of an unfree society, obviously for surveillance by perhaps not ill-intentioned government bureaucrats, as we have seen in China. But for me, the main concern is that we are habituating ourselves to types of daily behavior that are not exactly quantifiable, but that are real. And we wake up one day and look at our lives and are like, why is there a loneliness epidemic? Why is everybody so uncivil? Why is there no sort of active, thriving public square where people from different backgrounds can meet in person and everyone's not just staring at a computer screen or a phone? Well, it's because we chose it, but we chose it incrementally and we didn't even realize we were choosing against what came before. So, I mean, I have a whole screed in there about handwriting because that to me was kind of a perfect example of we had this well-intentioned goal of teaching kids important keyboarding and computer skills because computers are the future. So we cast aside teaching a lot of handwriting and cursive, eliminating it entirely in many schools. And everybody thought that was an improvement. But we now know from research and sort of reflecting on it that that's not the case. We threw aside stuff that was important for memory formation, for literacy, for all kinds of stuff. So making those choices more with more awareness, I think, is important, and dialing back our embrace of technology in some of these situations also important. Look, I mean, in the classroom, for example, I think it's very promising that lots of schools are saying, you know what, cell phones out, bell to bell, no cell phones. There's obviously a big debate, lively debate about in the social policy world about age limits for social media, and that's good. People are having these conversations now.
There's a lively
Um,
debate in our house. Sorry, go
Yes,
ahead.
no, no, I know. I wrote a piece about how 16 would be a great age limit for to keep, kids should have to be 16 to be on social media when my kids were, I think, 14, and they were like, "This is a terrible article. It's the worst thing you've ever written." I'm like, oh, fair enough. But these things actually, that is optimistic. The thing I gain the most optimism from though is watching Gen Z. These kids watch the millennials spend way too much time with technology, and they've heard all the warnings, and they themselves grew up with all of it. And they are often choosing more analog experiences. They have this game where they all go out to dinner, they put their phones in the middle of the table. Whoever picks up the phone first pays for dinner. They want to they're trying to recreate and find again some of those face-to-face experiences. And that's important, and we should really encourage that. That's an optimistic sign. But they're up against a lot. We all are. I mean, you have to actively choose the human thing day to day. You just have to be aware that you have to make that choice if it's important to you.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I want to start bringing in, speaking of humans, some of the other people who are here and their questions. So we've got a few of them here. And if anyone would like to add one to the mix, please do so. But I'll start with one question here. what is a simple thing we can do in our daily lives to consciously be more in touch with our humanity?
Okay, I'll give two answers, which is annoying. The first, don't pick up your interstitial time. Don't pick up your phone and fill it. Just be in interstitial time, those moments when you're waiting. More importantly, choose face-to-face interaction whenever possible. Choose to look at the human in the checkout line and say something to them. You know, if you get your Starbucks mobile order 4 days a week, on the fifth day, go into the Starbucks, speak to the person who makes your coffee, and say a few words. Just again, make an active effort to have face-to-face interaction with other people. Obviously, your loved ones, but strangers in public space. Try to be a good citizen. Try to be a person who interacts with others and gives those very small but important gestures of respect to other people.
Yeah, I think those are great. And this uh, connects to another question from Mia, who says that her antidote to the phone reach distraction is people watching. Airport lines, for example, are an incredible place to observe human behavior. So is it time to bring back live people watching as a replacement to the Instagram, social media mediated version of that?
Yes, I love this. And you know, it's such a good idea. Some corporation's going to want to make an app for it called people watching. And then they're going to like, so I say, yes, the old fashioned people watching. It's how, I mean, I spent some time reading lots of stuff that Darwin did and other observers of humans who try to understand over time why we do what we do. And some of their most brilliant insights come from doing just that, watching how people behave. We are interesting, fascinating, weird creatures, and it should be very revelatory. Good novelists do this too, like just observing how humans interact. Very important. You also learn something about yourself, like you learn to read other people better because you've seen a range of human behavior that gets flattened when it's on the screen.
Yeah, I am fascinated by the little things people do. For example, watching other people be bored and how they cope with that, right? You can think
A
to
lot of
yourself, oh,
fidgeting.
do I want to be in that person's shoes or not? Or, right, who is having the worst time on this line right now? Can we help that person? Uh, so this does bring up another interesting point from another question asker. It feels like taking these pauses are a luxury when people are worried about affording food and shelter, taking care of these basic necessities, delays that prevent us from working or being with family or investing and learning. Not everybody maybe has the resources, the temporal or the whatever financial, environmental resources to do that. So is there a literal opportunity cost to some of this? What are your thoughts?
Yes, there absolutely is, depending on the type of job you have, the type of employee and employer relationship you have. And this is something that I think doesn't get discussed enough. If you're an entry level employee without a lot of seniority, or you're in a kind of job that requires hands-on work where you're managed by other people, you don't get control of your time. And the luxury of having jobs, I happen to have one, so I appreciate it. You have a job where you actually get to control what you do and when you do it. That is not the experience of many, many working people in this world. So one thing that I think is important is that when we think about technology and what we can do to make it more humane and use it more humanely, we should start in schools and in the workplace, because those are two places that tend to eagerly embrace the new thing and think it's going to be an improvement. And you know what? It often is for the shareholders, but it really can have consequences for employees where their choice and their range of freedom is limited. They're surveyed more because it's possible to be surveyed more. Every keystroke on their computer is monitored. If you're a long haul trucker right now, for many companies, you're wearing a hat with sensors that alert someone at a facility at the trucking company if you're starting to fall asleep, or if maybe you've had too much caffeine or something you shouldn't have. Now, it's all done in the range of safety, efficiency, all of these tools, but it's turning human beings into cogs in a machine that doesn't benefit the people who are doing the work. And in that sense, I think there've been a lot of books written about, surveillance capitalism and all this other stuff. Those are important. But if you're an employee, it means there's a collective action issue, right? Other employees need to come together and say, you know what, we don't want money off of our health insurance plan if we slap on a smartwatch that monitors our physical signals, because it doesn't just monitor your steps, people. It monitors a lot more and can tell a lot more. So that's going to be a bottom-up movement, a workers' movement, and you see it in some industries that are being transformed by technology. but it's a really important point. I wasn't able to get into all of those dynamics in the book, except to say what the technologists want, what they would tell people who are in that situation is what Mark Andreessen told a lot of people, which is, well, your reality kind of sucks. So whenever you do have free time, just slap on some VR goggles and live the life you can't have in the real world, live it online. That's their solution to this problem. I think we need to fix the real world rather than shunt people off into the virtual one.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one of the things that I see you talking about is, or the lens that I bring to this conversation about the kind of cognitive freedom, let's say mental freedom in a workplace or a
Yes.
structured and formal environment, like a formal learning environment, is I think of it in terms of imagination. And so much of our formal educational system, those first jobs are all about pounding your willful imagination out of you and saying, pay attention, sit at this desk, do this, don't daydream, focus
Hmm.
on this task. We want to control not just your physical behavior, but your cognitive behavior, right? And we're going to sort of condition you to do things in a particular way. And it's not that that's intrinsically bad. We want everybody to learn how to read and write. We want to build a sort of cohesive sense of society and articulate the values and that we think are the right ones that should be shared. But it's pretty easy to go too far. And the more you turn people into cogs, the less they are going to be imaginative. They're going to be creative. They're going to open up, these doorways that wouldn't have occurred to anybody else. So I guess if I don't know if you have any reactions to that, if that's something that you think about, that this isn't that not only is efficiency sometimes problematic, or it shouldn't be a sort of a monolithic goal for
Hmm.
really any organization, but that there are these trade-offs with other things that might actually make that organization more resilient or more successful.
Yeah, it's funny, when you hear the debates about older employers complaining about their young employees, it's like, oh, they want a mental health day, or oh, they need to do their yoga, they want to work from home all the time. On the one hand, I have some sympathy with that because I think about some of my entry level jobs and I'm like, what are these kids are crazy. Who do they think they are? But on the other hand, they're expressing in a way, the way that they know how, a version of that feeling of being turned into cogs, and a lack of cognitive liberty. So this is a phrase that the founders of this country never thought they would ever have to say. But it is a real thing in law. Anita Farahay has a great book about, sort of your mental freedom that came out I think last year. It's great. In legal circles, if you're going to go to law school soon, make cognitive liberty your sort of specialization. You're going to have a lot of work in the future because the monitoring of the exhaust that we give off when we're using our brains. Because I don't think it's actually quite right that they can read our minds yet. That's what they're promising companies that they want to buy their technology, but it doesn't matter. It's just the monitoring in general is a huge blow to freedom. And if we're going to have that as the value because it leads to greater productivity and greater efficiency, then you're going to really sacrifice your workforce. And long term, that's a terrible strategy because you can't outsource all this stuff to AI. You can't outsource it all to technology. You need human beings, and you actually have to treat them in a decent way if you want them to be productive long term and to have a healthy, creative workplace.
Yeah, ultimately, it comes back to this question as a fellow humanist. What the point is to have a good world for human beings to exist in. It's not, we could. I had a conversation with a student doing research on AI in the university and saying, well, we were having this sort of theoretical conversation about, well, should this, what you just replace your professor with AI? The more that the professor is using AI to teach the class, at a certain point, you don't need the middleman anymore. Just have the students interact with the AI. But then the logical endpoint of that is, well, you don't need the students either, right? We'll just have this virtual environment. You can
Right.
have student AIs and you can have professor AI, and they can all just keep chatting at each other forever. So the efficiency in that sense, takes us down this kind of nihilistic pathway. So let me. Do we have time for maybe one or two more questions from the audience? So one is about smartwatches, which I think is interesting. How would you characterize the role of the smartwatch in our collective disembodiment? These notifications that pop up, is that is that any different from a phone? Is a watch is maybe something you can more organically integrate into something that you're doing, or is it basically the same?
So that was the promise of the watch, remember when it came out? And in fact, I had several friends who were early adopters of anything like this. And so they instantly got it. And they're like, now you can't tell me to put my phone away because it's on my watch and I won't be so distracted. I mean, they knew they were distracted. And I got to tell you, this is just as bad as this. I'm looking for the, like, looking at the watch. And then, of course, because the early adopters tend to be people who can afford the expense of the new technology, they're older, so they can't see it. So they're like staring. And in a weird way, it becomes more distracting because it's on their wrist and they get the notifications. One other thing I would say about that is that I think the quantified self movement, which got a lot of attention when it first came on the scene, and the, tracking your steps, and oh, this will be great for health. The more you know about how your physical body is moving, the healthier we'll all be. True enough. But these watches and the sensors that are coming down the pipeline, the ones that can be embedded in your employee badge, for example, they can tell you a lot more than just the steps you're taking. They are incredibly sophisticated. They can monitor heart rate, they can monitor galvanic skin response, i.e., if when your boss walks in the room and asks you a question, you have a flop sweat. I mean, like, and is the question I have for people is how much self-knowledge are you really gaining from these tools? And is it worth the trade-off of the amount of information you're making available, maybe to your boss, but also to the companies that are then selling your data? Because we do in this country have a lot of privatized data markets that your smartwatch habits can end up being sold to a health insurance company down the line. That is not a scenario that's implausible. So again, the trade-off is important. I think the watches are just as distracting as a phone because it takes you away from your face-to-face interactions. And so in that sense, they pose a similar social challenge.
Uh, I totally agree. I think that most of us have really no idea what kind of a deal we're making when we start to use some of these technologies, and it because it's largely secret, right?
Right.
It's not disclosed what
Right.
kinds of information are being gathered and how it's being used, who it's being sold to, and even someone who could try to answer that question today has no idea what might happen with that data, which lives forever 10 years from now.
So to give you one example of this, I wrote an article years and years ago for the New Atlantis when the first private genetic testing companies came out. And I said, this is like, there are many ways in which this will be helpful, but there's also this risk, which is that what if the company goes bankrupt and what happens to your genetic data, which is so then fast forward, 15 years, 23andMe, which I know a lot of people who did that cheek swab and got their, genetic thing and thought that was the neatest, coolest thing ever. And now what happens now that that company is in a state of crisis? What happens to that genetic information? So we have so many examples where really sensitive information about ourselves that we should have the power to control and share is out of our control. And getting it back is very difficult, but we can try to stop it before we got to stop it at the choke point. Before we slap that watch on our wrist, we should see what the terms and conditions are really committing us to do.
But it is really difficult, right? Because it
Yeah,
requires a kind of monastic relationship with the world to say, oh, I'm going
right.
to abstain from all of these things that everybody is using. And sometimes it's simply impossible.
Exactly.
Maybe not with a smartwatch, that feels like a choice, but
Yeah.
some of these things are different. So this is kind of a devil's advocate question, which I'll preface by saying it reminds me of the Plato and the Phaedrus complaining about how writing is going to ruin everything.
Yes.
So what do you think about reading a book or a paper newspaper while standing in line? Is that better?
Uh, it's still taking no. I mean, not if your argument is that you actually need fallow. And I would make this argument that your mind needs time to be fallow, for one
Mm.
thing. And if you're in public space, be in public space. Look around and see what's going on. Now, if you're at an airport and you've been like hanging out and they say your flight will be delayed 4 hours, you're gonna need a distraction. So obviously, I'm not. I'm this isn't an either or. It's an awareness and selection of things that are important. So people have all kinds of ways of distracting themselves. These guys who used to do worry beads, they're like things you can do to just pass the time. But you take those up with awareness and you use them in moderation. And that is not what we do with our phones. And actually, once you open a book, you'll finish it and set it down. And you know what? No one's reading you while you're reading the book unless you're on a Kindle. If you're reading a paper book or a paper newspaper, there, as you said, time horizons matter. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, and it's also a private experience. I think we should be having fewer private experiences in public because I think it makes us better people to be in public with other people. That said, sometimes you're going to want to distract yourself if you have a delay, but try to find those moments where you feel the urge and you resist it because that builds character, it builds judgment, it builds awareness.
Uh, I think that's a great point, and that brings me to this last question, which feels like bringing us full circle back to the beginning of this conversation about the ubiquity of Zoom and video meetings, and how has that changed the way we show up at work and engage with coworkers? It seems like it promotes a sort of hyper self-vigilance and the sensation of being observed all the time. I know I usually turn off the self view when
Mm.
I'm doing Zoom because there's a specific cognitive load associated with just seeing yourself represented in this digital screen. But what do you think?
So there was some fascinating research that came out right after the pandemic that looked at time horizons, memory, and experience. Where, if to summarize it very rudimentarily, there when you have the same sort of experience through the same medium, but it's very different life events. So think about how we all lived during the pandemic, or those of us who were lucky enough to do our jobs on Zoom and weren't, essential workers out in the world. So there was a day I wrote it down because I was like, why do I feel so weird? Where I did a podcast with my podcast buddies, and then I had two work meetings, and then I went to a bar mitzvah online, and then I met up with a bunch of friends, and then I did like a Zoom cocktail hour with some work colleagues, and then I had a call with a family member at the end of the day, all on Zoom, all with me sitting in the same place. And a week later, I had trouble remembering the events, and this is what the research found. It's about embodied cognition, really, right? We are embodied physically, and our bodies and our minds work in conjunction. So when we're just using Zoom, we're not using everything about moving from place to place so that our memory doesn't anchor in the same way. If I'd gone to the synagogue and gone to the bar mitzvah, I would have a different memory of it, a more formative memory. We know this about the way the brain works. So what Zoom does is flatten our time horizons, which compromises our memory. And in a pinch like a pandemic, it's a lifesaver, right? But when we start to choose that over actually getting up, getting dressed, going to the office, sitting around, where again, spontaneous serendipitous interactions can lead to creative solutions to problems. And also you get to hear the office gossip in a different way than you would if you were doing it on text. Um, it's important. Those are important. So Zoom is a tool, but if we start to choose it in place of the face to face, we will lose something important. And I think that's where, again, we have to make the choice that might seem more difficult because long term, it's what's best for us.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it brings to mind another one of these words that is in the background of this conversation, serendipity, just opening yourself up to the unexpected possibilities when you let yourself get out there into the world with all of its weirdness and strange collisions and happenstance. I hope that we all remembered this conversation. Thank you so much and congratulations on the book. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and for your wonderful questions. Christine, it was lovely to see you and
You too.
best of luck.
Thanks so much. It was great to talk to you again.